war echo louder than they have in years, I'm here today because despite what he thinks, Donald Trump does not have the authority to unilaterally force us into war. He may have never read the Constitution, but I have. So let me direct his attention to Article 1, which makes it clear that the president does not have the power to declare war. Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I come here today to support Senator Kaine's War Powers resolution. You know, I am proud of every mission that I completed in Iraq, but I would never wish another needless, endless, unjustified war like the one that I served in on anyone else. I wouldn't wish it on the heroes whose blood would be soaked into that desert sand. I would not wish it on their families who'd spend their days anxiously awaiting for news from half a world away. And I wouldn't wish it on the American people who are desperate for their president to focus on bringing their costs down here at home, not on starting new, expensive forever wars continents away. So I'm here today to keep true a promise I first made 2 decades ago. I ran for Congress so that when the drums of war started beating once again, I'd be in a position to make sure that our elected officials fully considered the true cost of the war, not just in dollars and cents, but in human lives as well. That was the vow I made to the troops I deployed with and all those who've served since I hung up my uniform. And today, I'm speaking here under this great Capitol dome to keep that most sacred promise. Because sadly right now, American service members are already in harm's way, 6,000 miles east of what could be yet another preventable war. These troops are ready to do their jobs no matter what, just as they've done time after time, tour after tour. So to me, it is tragic that even as they prepare to do their jobs, our president and certain members of this chamber seem so ready to neglect their own. As we all know, on Saturday morning, without any known imminent threat to America or American interests, Donald Trump launched an illegal military campaign against Iran. Look, I want a democratic Iran, and I want to see the Iranian people free from the iron grip of its brutal authoritarian regime. And I'm not about to shed a tear for the Ayatollah's death. He was no friend of the United States, nor to his own people. He was responsible for the brutal murders of thousands of his own citizens in just the past few months alone. However, my first concern is always going to be the national security of the United States. And I'm troubled because of the consequences that are sure to come because of Trump's actions. Our troops and Americans all around the world are at greater risk because Trump wanted to thump his chest and look like a tough guy on TV. For no real reason he can explain, Trump is marching us closer and closer to another costly, bloody, protracted conflict, a war without any defined end state, and even without a concept of a plan for how to prevent the chaos and instability that will come next. Far from making America greater, or better, or stronger, or whatever new adjective he's using this week, Trump's actions have made our nation and our allies less safe. He's made them less secure. By continuing to strain our military with wars of choice, Trump is handing a gift to bad actors like Russia and the PRC, as his never-ending chaos makes it harder for our armed forces to focus on defending our critical interests in places like the Indo-Pacific. So no, Trump's actions over the past 72 hours, or ever, haven't put America first. They've made the situation for America worse. The sad fact of the matter is that what we're facing today is in large part a manufactured crisis. Iran is no ally of ours. We've been adversaries since long before Trump took office. And I have always condemned their proxy activity and ballistic missile program. And I certainly agree that they cannot be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. But we can't forget that Donald Trump is the one who pulled the US out of the very deal that was limiting their weapons development program. Trump is the one who made sure Iran no longer had to play by the rules that curbed their nuclear production. It was Trump, and his inability to conduct foreign policy is what made today's nightmare a reality. His historical incompetence is what gave them the matchbox and the motivation to start a fire. And now he's angry that it's starting to catch. He's mad because they're doing the very things his action encouraged them to do. It's circular logic, which already has fatal consequences. Fatal for the 6 American heroes who've already lost their lives in this conflict. And fatal for the hundreds of civilians who've already become the most horrible kind of collateral. Moms and dads who this evening should be able to sit down to eat dinner with their little girl, who should be able to kiss their little boy goodnight, who should be able to go to bed dreaming of tomorrow that doesn't include missiles or misery. Now he has created a power vacuum in Iran, resulting in an unstable regime that is willing to do anything to hold on to power. Now he's created an open invitation for well-funded, organized terrorist groups to swoop in and snatch away any chance the Iranian people have of freedom and self-governance. War is always tragic, but when it's preventable, it's not just tragic, but a travesty too. Trump wouldn't let himself be dragged by the bone spurs to serve in uniform when his country needed him. So how dare he try to drag us into yet another war of his choice today? But this draft dodger is too infatuated with maximum pressure to consider even minimum diplomacy. Once again, the Trump foreign policy doctrine has proven reckless, senseless, and dangerous. A doctrine in which fact and fiction are one and the same, and one in which avarice outweighs advice every damn time. It's shameful, terrifying, that we have a commander-in-chief who seems to come to military decisions by virtue of temper tantrums and announces them via tweet. A president who doesn't seem to care that if he keeps to the path of fire and fury that he's been treading, our own homeland will be in greater danger. More wounded warriors will be sent to Walter Reed, and more fallen heroes will be laid to rest in Arlington. A president who's so obsessed with being the tough guy that he doesn't seem to care. A president who's happy to squander the lives of our heroes for his own personal gain. Now, after this weekend, he has officially traded deterrence for instability and chaos and made us all less safe in the process. Americans, certainly, but also our partners in the region and the Iranian people themselves, who did not ask for any of this. Iranian families who've suffered for decades under the Ayatollah's tyrannical iron grip and who, at long last, just want to feel safe and secure. Look, Trump may have run to his podiatrist instead of running towards danger in Vietnam, but I actually know what it's like to leave your blood, your sweat, your limbs in a war zone half a world away. So I know what's at stake for the thousands of troops this administration is getting ready to send into harm's way. And I can tell you this, it's a whole lot easier to cover your eyes and order other Americans to sacrifice if you don't have to sacrifice anything yourself. It's much easier to ignore the everyday realities of war from inside the hallowed halls of the White House, but it's nearly impossible if you've been outside the wire yourself. So as those drums of war echo louder than they have in years, I'm here today because despite what he thinks, Donald Trump does not have the authority to unilaterally force us into war. He may have never read the Constitution, but I have. So let me direct his attention to Article 1, which makes it clear that the president does not have the power to declare war. Only Congress does. We are the ones tasked with deciding when and how Americans are sent into combat. We are the ones charged with that most solemn duty. Yet, Trump is acting as if Article 1 simply doesn't exist, as if obeying the Constitution is optional, as if our founding document is just a yellowing, crumbling piece of paper he can crumble up at will. Refusing to allow him to get away with this must not be a partisan issue. No matter if you're struggling to pay rent or your name is plastered in fake gold on a building on Fifth Avenue, no one can ignore the Constitution. No matter if you're a Mar-a-Lago worker pulling double shifts or the President of the United States, no one is above the law. Look, I believe there are certain solemn, urgent times when our military must be called on to defend us. There are certain moments when the threat in question is significant and imminent, instances when military force is the most effective tool at hand, and that using it is necessary to protect America and her interests. The thing is, from what little information Trump has shared publicly so far, this is not one of those times. But if the administration thinks I'm wrong, then the floor is theirs. We're only a 20-minute walk from the White House. It's not that hard to find us here. We're the building with the big dome on top. If they actually believe that this war is justified, then they need to come to Congress and do their jobs, explaining their case and giving the American people a say through their elected representatives. They need to respect the American people enough to actually tell them why they're being forced to bear the cost of this conflict, both in dollars and cents and daughters and sons. The White House needs to respect our service members enough to prove why war with Iran is worth turning more moms and dads into Gold Star parents. They need to prove that they've thought this through enough that they can tell us what an end state in Iran would look like. Then, when their case has been made, when Congress's debate is done, we in this chamber must vote. It's our duty, it is our burden. It's the least we can do for those willing to sacrifice everything to safeguard our democracy. But if the Trump administration refuses to do that, if they refuse to adhere to the first article of our Constitution, well then it begs the question, what are they hiding? You know, this week we'll vote on Senator Kaine's War Powers resolution, and I'm well aware that many of my colleagues are claiming to have a difficult time deciding how to vote. To them, let me say this, we ask a lot of tough things of our troops and military families. Serving in a combat zone is hard. Hugging your husband or your wife, your father or your daughter for the last time before they deploy, not knowing if you'll ever see them again, that's hard. The least we can do here in return is ensure that we senators take our duties as seriously as our military men and women do theirs. So to my Republican colleagues, please think about the fact that Trump cared so little about your beliefs on this matter that he willfully, illegally circumvented our chamber entirely, preferring to sow chaos and fear, leaving Americans in the lurch and their elected representatives in the dark. choosing to start an unlawful war rather than simply ask for your expertise, for your constitutionally mandated vote. And think about that Trump still has not been able to tell us of an imminent threat to American interests that would have actually required military action anywhere near this scale. And then, after reflecting on all of that, all I'm asking is that you vote for what you know is right. Moving forward, I'll come back to this chamber every afternoon if necessary to remind the nation of the hard lessons learned the last time a president rashly sent our sons and daughters into another unjustified war in the Middle East, trying to ensure that this time we do right by our troops, trying to ensure that this time we actually fully, soberly consider the consequences of Washington's decisions on those who serve and their families. God bless each and every one of our troops who are in harm's way right now. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Under the vast dome of the United States Capitol, Senator Tammy Duckworth rose and delivered a warning that echoed far beyond the Senate chamber. She spoke not as a distant observer of policy, but as someone who has worn the uniform, someone who has felt the cost of war in a way few lawmakers ever will. In supporting Senator Tim Kaine's War Powers resolution, she did more than cast a vote. She drew a line. She challenged the very foundation of how this nation decides when to send its sons and daughters into harm's way. Her words were direct. The president, she argued, launched a military campaign against Iran without an imminent threat to the United States, without consultation, without congressional authorization. She described it as illegal. She called it reckless. And she asked a question that now hangs heavy over Washington. If there was no immediate danger to America or American interests, then why was this action taken at all? Duckworth's speech was not a defense of Iran's regime. She made that clear. She acknowledged decades of hostility. She condemned the authoritarian grip of its leadership. But her focus was not sympathy for adversaries. It was responsibility to Americans, responsibility to the troops already stationed thousands of miles away. Responsibility to families who wait anxiously for news. Responsibility to a constitution that outlines, in plain language, who has the authority to declare war. Article 1st, not Article 2nd, Congress, not the president alone. This was the core of her argument, that war powers are not optional, that the Constitution is not a suggestion, that no matter how powerful the office, no president can unilaterally drag a nation into conflict without the consent of the people's representatives. In that moment, the debate ceased to be only about Iran. It became about the structure of American democracy itself, about separation of powers, about whether the balance designed by the founders still holds, or whether it bends under political pressure and executive impulse. Duckworth invoked history. She spoke of Iraq, of lessons learned, of promises made to those she served beside. She reminded the chamber that the cost of war is never abstract. It is measured in empty seats at dinner tables, in hospital rooms, in flag-draped coffins carried with solemn precision. It is measured in futures altered forever. She accused the administration of manufacturing a crisis born from earlier foreign policy decisions, withdrawing from agreements that once constrained Iran's nuclear ambitions. She argued that instability did not appear overnight, but was fueled by choices made years prior. In her telling, what is unfolding now is not inevitability, it is consequence. And then came the moral charge. She described a commander-in-chief who, in her view, confuses toughness with strategy, who favors spectacle over consultation, who moves swiftly with force but slowly with diplomacy. She painted a picture of a White House acting first and explaining later. Or perhaps not at all. The question she posed was simple and devastating. If this war is justified, why not come to Congress? Why not make the case openly? Why not trust the American people enough to explain the evidence, outline the objectives, define the end state? It was not merely a partisan appeal. She directed her remarks to Republican colleagues as well, urging them to reflect on whether they were sidelined in a decision of enormous consequence. She reminded them that senators are not spectators. They are constitutionally mandated decision makers when it comes to war. This is where the hearing transcended rhetoric and entered the realm of constitutional reckoning. Because if Congress allows its authority to erode, if it becomes accustomed to after-the-fact briefings instead of before-the-fact authorization, then the balance of power shifts quietly, permanently. Precedent becomes practice. Practice becomes norm. And the role of the legislature narrows, not by amendment, but by neglect. Duckworth framed the vote on the War Powers Resolution as a test not only of policy, but of principle. A test of whether lawmakers will shoulder the burden of debate rather than defer to executive action. A test of whether fear and urgency will override process and law. At stake, she argued, are not just geopolitical calculations, but the integrity of democratic governance. If the president can initiate large-scale military engagement without a clear, articulated imminent threat and without congressional approval, then what remains of the checks and balances designed to prevent impulsive conflict? Her speech ended not with anger, but with solemn resolve. She pledged to return to the floor as often as necessary, to remind the chamber of past mistakes. The drums of war, she said, are beating. The drums of war, she said, are beating once again. But in America, drums alone do not declare war. The Constitution does not bend to noise. It requires deliberation. And so the question now belongs not just to one senator or one president, but to the nation. Will Congress reclaim its authority? Will the executive respect its limits? Will the lessons of past conflicts shape present decisions? History is watching. Allies are watching. Adversaries are watching. And American service members, standing ready wherever they are deployed, are depending on leaders to weigh each choice with gravity. War is never a headline alone. It is a decision that reshapes generations. If democracy means anything, it means that such decisions are debated in the open, that power is checked, that authority is earned through law, not assumed through position. The vote on the War Powers Resolution is more than procedural. It is a measure of whether constitutional responsibility still guides American leadership. Stay informed, stay engaged, and if you believe that accountability matters, that the rule of law matters, that the Constitution matters, then stand with those demanding answers. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA. Support our work to expose the truth.